The opinions expressed in the following program are not necessarily those of Eastlink TV, its sponsors, or partners.
Hi there, I'm Gloria McCluskey. You're watching Destination Dartmouth. My destination this morning is in beautiful downtown Dartmouth at the Gary Street Cemetery, and my guest is David Jones, Dartmouth historian. Join me. Hi, David.
Hi, Gloria.
Thank you for being here with me this morning. Isn't it a gorgeous day in beautiful Dartmouth?
It's beautiful.
And David, the first question I have, I think I know the answer. What got you into history? Your great-great-uncle?
Yes, so John Martin, who wrote the story of Dartmouth. I've just been brought up in that tradition of being curious about Dartmouth. You know, my family's lived here for hundreds of years, and we have a real connection to this place. And not only John Martin, but in conversations with my grandmother, Marie Jones, and my dad, Martin, history just seems to be in my blood, and I love Dartmouth with all my heart.
Great. And you know, David, there's so many people who lived in Dartmouth who've learned a lot from these shows, things they didn't even know. Now, today we're here in the Gary Street Cemetery, and I know there are lots of people in Dartmouth who don't even know that this cemetery is here, and who's buried here and so on. So we're going to get into that today, David. So it's known as the Gary Street Cemetery, but St. Peter's Church used it at one time, and then St. Paul's.
That's right.
Yeah.
So in 1835, this plot of land where we're sitting right now had been a part of the historic Dartmouth Common, which has been here in the city since the 1780s, when the Quakers came to the downtown area that we know and love today. In 1835, this was carved out so that St. Peter's Church could use this as a burial ground. Now, the St. Peter's that we know on Maple Street today by Sullivan's Pond, it's actually had some different homes. So we know that before the 60s, before the fire, there was a stone St. Peter's in pretty much the same spot. But earlier than that, Gloria, there was a St. Peter's Church that's on today's Auchterlony Street, near where Prince and Edward Street meet, and that used to be called Chapel Lane. And if you know that parking lot, everyone, it gets a little narrow, the little lane that's there, and that's because that's built on the old town grid of Dartmouth, so it's a different size, and that's exactly where that St. Peter's Church was. So there actually had been a burial ground there, but it was becoming too overcrowded, even though it hadn't been used for many years. It was on too small of a plot of land in the downtown. So they started to move burials here around 1835.
Good. There's another little burial ground up on India Street.
Yes, so in the north end, in the Tufts Cove area, you know, there's a beautiful graveyard, and that's been lovingly restored by Gary Wright, and many of his ancestors are buried there, and it has a great history with the Tufts Cove families.
Yes. And there would be some Mi'kmaq buried there too, likely.
It's hard to say that, Gloria, without really knowing, but yes, there's a great Mi'kmaq history in that area, in Tufts Cove and Turtle Grove, and a really curious relationship between Gary Street Cemetery and the Tufts Cove Cemetery is if you visit the Tufts Cove Cemetery today, there are many flat slate stones that are aligned. And we don't know if those are early European settlers or if those are Mi'kmaq people, but John Martin in the Story of Dartmouth writes that there were slate stones here at Gary Street that were lined up together, and he was associating those with Mi'kmaq burials. So that's a really interesting connection.
But there are a lot of Mi'kmaq buried in here.
That's what it says in the Story of Dartmouth.
Because when I was mayor, Rocky Jones, the late Rocky Jones, chief, and a couple of other people came to visit me in my office one day, very upset, because the Dartmouth Recreation Department, they were over here digging, looking for burial sites.
So that they could put in new burials possibly for St. Paul's.
They were very upset because there's Mi'kmaq people buried throughout here, and the word then was, before you buried somebody, you had to make sure, do a test to make sure there wasn't a body down there already. Yeah. So the Mi'kmaq were the first to be buried here, I suppose. Were they, David?
It's hard to know, Gloria, if we have pre-contact burials here. That's something that could maybe someday be determined archaeologically, but in the very least we can look at Mi'kmaq traditions and talk to the community about that. And you can also look at how the ground is situated at Gary Street and look for patterns in areas where there are known pre-contact burials. But certainly there is this Mi'kmaq, strong Mi'kmaq tradition of burials being here in this area, and it's definitely the case throughout downtown Dartmouth.
So you wouldn't have any idea how many people are buried in here. You wouldn't
It's
know.
hard to know. You would have to go through
There's
St.
no
Peter's
markers.
Church records.
Yeah, and they have a great big map. I've seen it. At St. Paul's. St. Paul's had a map.
I've been looking for this map, Gloria. A lot of people told me that Father Laba, who was here in the 60s, that he was doing a lot of restorative work in the graveyard.
I saw the map.
I'd love to see it myself.
It's probably still in the glebe up there.
We're going to have to look for it together.
Yeah, because I know it's there. And David, who were the first Dartmouth people to be buried here? Was it the Duns?
So the Duns, this is really interesting. Just behind us, Gloria, where we're sitting on this beautiful day, there is a concrete vault, which I think inside is made of stone. I think the concrete was later for support, and that's where 13
it looks
Dunn,
like it was put over it.
Yes, 13 Dunn family members were buried there. We think starting in the 1840s, and Michael Dunn was the father of the family, and he had a grocery business in downtown Dartmouth.
They had a plumbing business too.
Later on, the Dunns did have a plumbing business.
Yeah.
And so there are 13 coffins in there, and John Martin, The Story of Dartmouth, wrote that in 1950 he went in with Mr. Dunn, with Colin Dunn. He went into the vault, and they looked at the 13 burials, and they actually opened one up. And in The Story of Dartmouth, he writes that he gazed upon one of the adult skeletons. So I don't think I'm ready to do that in my historical explorations.
I read somewhere about a columbarium. They're not calling that a columbarium.
You could call this a crypt. You could call it.
They called it. There was
a vault.
Crypt, but then they talked about a columbarium here.
I didn't know about that. It could be that that's a loose association with the burial vault. But there are definitely coffins inside there, and John Martin saw them. And there's a beautiful picture that survives at the Dartmouth Heritage Museum of him in there with Colin Dunn.
And we'll never see it because it's up in the museum.
Well,
in the artifacts.
I've actually, it's out there.
Is
and
it?
Yes, I have an article with Halifax Today where I talk about Gary Street Cemetery, and the picture is there for everyone to see.
Oh, isn't that great? Yeah.
And you can go look at these pictures if you want at the Dartmouth Heritage Museum, because those ones aren't stored at the warehouse like all the artifacts. Those ones are on their database at the Evergreen House.
So David, you're not sure if the Dunns were the first Dartmouth people?
I think there were earlier burials here. So the Dunns would have been a little later in the 1840s, but if we walk around, there are graves that date to the 1830s and 1840s, and those would have been Catholic parishioners of Dartmouth.
But this is the only...
this is the only burial vault that's in this area. It's quite unique. And,
in the city,
and John Martin speaks of it being unique even in Nova Scotia.
Yeah. I know first when I came to Dartmouth, we came up to see it, and it was very weird. You came in here at night and put a little light in the hole and kind of looked in, but you couldn't see anything when you looked in like that. But you said it's rock inside.
John Martin describes it as stone-lined, and I think that would line up with the 1840s construction.
And then that probably started to deteriorate.
I believe so, and it was probably the
concrete.
city that put that in concrete. And John Martin writes that the last burial, I believe it was a son of Michael Dunn, and that was in the 1860s.
Okay, David, we're going to take a break. You're watching Destination Dartmouth. I'm Gloria McCluskey, and my guest is David Jones, Dartmouth's historian. We're back, David. Let's talk about the changes in this cemetery over the years, David. It was a pretty flat piece of land at one time.
Yes, so looking at old pictures of this cemetery seems to have gone through a lot of landscape changes. And at the HRM archives, which are very hard to get to in Burnside, and their hours aren't great, but once you get there, there are pictures that show neighborhood improvement program going on in the 70s, and it looked like there was a great deal of landscaping in this park and cemetery. And so a lot of the features that people assume are natural or even burial mounds, those were man-made in the 1970s, including the large stones that were put here and the mounds throughout the
They're
cemetery.
almost like drumlins in places.
Yes, so Dartmouth was certainly carved out by the glaciers, but in this part of the park, it's gone through changes that look like they're glacial, in some spots, but they were actually made
Man-made.
by people in the 70s.
So David, why did they stop using it? There's a lot of land here that
So
has
I
no
think
burial.
that today when we look around and look at the number of gravestones, I don't think that reflects how many people are actually buried here.
No.
So I believe that it did become overcrowded actually. And then eventually the new Catholic cemetery for St. Peter's, that was moved to Victoria Road, so that was another piece of land that was carved out of the Dartmouth Commons. But then later on, as you were mentioning, this started to be used in the 20th century as a St. Paul's Church burial ground. So there are old burials and more recent burials.
Yes.
But I think it was a matter of, like you say, trying to find spots that weren't already occupied by human remains,
But I
and then
don't-
it became a park.
I don't think they use it any longer. I don't think
As far as
anybody-
I'm aware, no
I
one
don't
is
think
buried here
anybody from
anymore.
St. Paul's is buried here anymore. And it's a beautiful little spot. I mean, you go down the back of it and it's kind of flat. And a couple of years ago, there was either a volleyball net or a basketball net there, so people were coming in and using
Lots of
it.
people continue to use this park.
Yeah, and what a
and
beautiful spot here. Just
you
to
have a lovely view
sit.
of the harbour, of downtown Dartmouth, of Halifax. It's a really nice spot to come and contemplate.
The cemetery at Indian Street, I guess it is, or road, is bigger than this one, I guess, is it?
It's
Not as much area, but it seems there are more gravesites.
There seems to be a few more gravestones there that date to the earlier days, but this is certainly a larger parcel of land.
And the Mi'kmaq certainly take, you know,
A great interest
great
in this
interest
area,
because,
certainly,
yeah, they have
because
a
of the
plaque
history
over
of
there.
their ancestors being buried here.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess there are no more changes planned for this cemetery now, David.
As far as I'm aware,
Yeah, it'll just,
it will remain the way it is, and possibly there could be more upkeep. We were saying that there used to be some of the foliage was cut back before, and
yeah,
that could be something.
Japanese knotweed
And that's a big problem all
kept
throughout
cutting
the area.
that back, so because the cemetery became a place that people could come in here, people you didn't want in here. So I had them clean that so you could see in when you're passing down Windmill Road, which was great. But it's quiet today. Usually you see people passing through here. Leads from Fairbank Street. And there's a nice little landing over there. You've seen that.
Yep, and that dates back to those neighborhood improvement programs
Oh,
to the
does it?
70s when they built that wooden
Made
stairway
access.
that led from Fairbanks down
That was
to
the
here.
1970s.
And for those that are wondering, you can get to Geary Street Cemetery from Albany Drive, from Geary Street, and from Fairbanks Street. So it forms a triangle here in downtown Dartmouth.
And from walking up the railway tracks, I guess,
Exactly.
you can still get here. So, how many cemeteries have you checked out?
Well, I'm really interested in Geary Street Cemetery, and one that also piques my interest is the part of Christchurch Cemetery on Victoria Road
Yeah.
that is known as the old Quaker burial ground.
Yeah.
So that's the older part of the cemetery.
Yeah, that's really old.
It could
that
go
one.
even back before the Quakers.
Yeah, and then they moved to Mount Herman after that, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't think we're using as much many grave sites now. More
Yeah,
people are
I
being
think
cremated, and
that's
it's,
definitely an option for people, but I think here in Dartmouth it's just a matter of we're losing that land in the sense of these graveyards are filling up, so people are being
Yeah.
buried outside the
Yeah,
city, and that was
yeah.
even a problem in the 1830s. You couldn't be burying people anymore in the downtown; it was too overcrowded.
And then when they were building the apartment buildings up at Micmac Mall, they ran into a graveyard.
There was the
there.
African Nova Scotian
African Nova
Cemetery,
Scotian people.
and the church up there was known as the Colored Meeting House, and that survives in a sense with the Victoria Road Baptist Church. So that congregation moved from the end of Creighton Avenue down to Victoria Road,
Yeah.
and the church that they use today, that actually used to be the Christchurch Sunday School, and they moved that up.
That's a lovely little church.
It's beautiful,
And you go in there, you just feel the spirit
yeah,
when you're in there.
a real
doing
sense of
church
community.
service.
So
Real
there
sense.
were burials that were disturbed from that construction, and those bodies were
Yes.
moved to Christchurch Cemetery, directly across from Victoria Road Baptist
And they
Church.
they didn't even know about it.
Well, I believe that the cemetery would have overgrown, and that was a
I mean,
surprise maybe to some, but I think
mean,
the community would have known
contractors,
about that.
They
Yes,
didn't know.
the community definitely knew
And
about
when
it.
they started building there, I remember the fuss. You know, they ran into this graveyard.
And there's a plaque, Gloria, that's inside Victoria Road Baptist Church that mentions the early descendants of that community that are buried across the street now at Christ Church Cemetery.
So how many were there, David? Do you know?
I don't know how many human remains were uncovered, but this would have been a cemetery that had a long history, because that's been a community for hundreds of years in Dartmouth, just by Lake Banook and Lake Micmac.
Yeah, just across from Micmac Mall.
That's right, and that's not only a cemetery that not many people know about, but that's a community that has not received too much attention, and that's something that we should look more into its history, and the fact that there was African Nova Scotian community that was marginalized on the edge of town.
Because Creighton Avenue was, you know, where the
settlement was.
Where the settlement
and
was.
there are still African Nova Scotian people that live there today.
And of course, as usual, there was a dump in there.
There was a dump, an incinerator, and the road wasn't paved.
Dump in front of, you know, we just seem to think this is a good place to dump it.
To put these, and that was the same problem with what was done to Africville. That's called environmental racism.
Yeah, it is. Of course it was.
Yeah.
But I don't think we have any of the black families, the black settlers still living there,
Yes,
do
yep.
we? They're the same family?
Yes, still
They're
there. In the little extension of
the little
Creighton
extension,
Avenue.
yeah. I knew there was a family there, but I didn't know it dated back to the early settlers.
Yes, it's the same families that
Same
live there
families.
today.
But I think they're the only ones there.
Yeah, the community is dying out.
They've rebuilt it and built the big new houses and
Yeah.
everything. So it's quite a change. He must feel kind of alone in there. But it's a nice little spot. Yeah, well, David, we're just about ready to take another break, and we'll be back. You're watching Destination Dartmouth here in beautiful downtown Dartmouth in the Gary Street Cemetery lot. And my guest is Dartmouth's historian, David Jones. We'll be right back. Okay, David, we're back. Finish our talk about this great spot here in Dartmouth. David, there's some Spanish.
Yeah, this is quite interesting,
Nobility.
Gloria. So in the story of Dartmouth, it's recorded that a relative of Empress Eugenie of Spain is buried here, and she had quite a colorful life here in Dartmouth. And the story of Dartmouth is full of so many fascinating stories, and it's a book that if you're lucky to have a copy of it, you open it up and there's something new and surprising on every
that
page.
The one that,
John Martin
oh,
wrote.
yeah, I have the book.
And so this relative is buried here. Her gravestone isn't visible to us.
Yeah.
John Martin thinks that it would be buried underneath the sod. But there is a monument from 1962.
I suppose it was so long the sod grew around it.
There's been so many changes in this cemetery, and for a while it was neglected. So there could be many gravestones that are underneath the sod, and there would be many burials, Gloria, that didn't have gravestones, at least not permanent ones. There may have been wooden markers.
So David, how old was she?
I think she lived to be an elderly lady.
Oh, so she lived in Dartmouth for a long time?
Yeah, on the outskirts
She wasn't
of
just
Dartmouth.
visiting?
No, she lived here with her relatives.
So David, right in front of us here, there are a number of very old tombstones, very fancy.
The carvings are beautiful and so intricate.
And the writing on them is so different. And you looked, some of the people were very young, 33, 37.
We were walking around earlier, and the dates are quite early. So these headstones would date to when the cemetery was opened in 1835 and when it was consecrated almost a decade later in the 1840s. And it's just an instant history lesson about the people that lived and died here in Dartmouth.
And they started, I guess, with the burials down close to the front, because these are all in front of us.
Now, sometimes, Gloria, it's hard to tell if these gravestones are in their original position. So some of these could have possibly been found partly buried or covered up with brush, and they put them back in place.
And there is one flat one there.
There are several ones that are half buried in the ground.
And some of them, if you look, from the front of them to the back, there's not much space. So it looks as though whether grew around them or whether they moved them there. You can learn a lot from looking at tombstones, David.
So much.
When we were kids, I grew up down in Port Dufferin, and we had a graveyard there right on the water, and ships used to come in there at one time. The Dufferin was one of the ships, and we would find graves of young sailors. You know, and we'd feel very sad.
From all around the world.
Feel very sad because there they were down there from all around the world buried there. So it's very interesting. As you said, you can learn a lot from going. Now, David, you mentioned that there is a plaque here to talk
there
about
is
the
a monument.
Duns. A monument.
And in 1962, it was unveiled by Father Labba, and the Dunn family were there to unveil it because of their connection to their ancestors being buried in the vault. So Mike Dunn, Paul Dunn, Elaine Boxall, Mrs. Florence Dunn, and Francis Tomshaw, and Christine, that's the family. But the ones that I mentioned were there for the unveiling, and there's a photo that survives at the Dartmouth Heritage Museum of the plaque being unveiled. And that monument is still here today. However, it's no longer upright. It's buried in the side of the hill, and that mentions the Mi'kmaq history of the graveyard. It mentions the vault.
Oh, that's all on the monument.
Yeah, and that information's coming from the story of Dartmouth.
David, there's a plaque over here from the to commemorate the Mi'kmaq.
Yes, so for the 250th anniversary of Dartmouth, there were plaques put all around Dartmouth and Halifax by the Halifax Foundation. And this one in particular commemorates Mi'kmaq heritage and history in the Halifax region, and they decided to put it at Geary Street Cemetery because of the Mi'kmaq connection to this place.
Great. Was this place fenced at one time? It looks like remnants.
Yes, you can
old fencing.
you can see remnants of old fence posts that used to be around here. And John Martin says that there used to be a stone wall that lined the edges of Geary Street Cemetery.
I bet there was, because the beautiful commons over here
is full of stone walls.
Dillman Park, of course, Leighton Dillman built those.
And we're just underneath the spot where he did so much work, and the park that's named after him today.
And donated all his time.
Yes, certainly.
I can remember walking down when I worked at City Hall, a cool spring morning or a fall morning. He'd be down on his hands and knees there.
No matter the weather.
No matter the weather, doing all that work. And I don't know if he got the recognition or the appreciation he deserved, but at least we finally named the park for him. But this is a beautiful part of the city where the land slopes and you get such a great...
And just the views, for now, knock on wood, are beautiful of the harbour. And we encourage more people to come down to the Dartmouth Commons or to come and reflect in Geary Street Cemetery and learn about our history that many people, even right now, are driving by and probably have no idea.
People don't even know that's the
that it's
Commons.
here.
They don't even know where the Leighton Dillman Park is when I mention it.
Yeah.
And that is such a beautiful spot. And it all ties in with this.
We need more people taking the ferry from Halifax, especially in the summer.
Yeah.
If they knew that the Commons were here, they would love to come have a picnic with their families.
And it's kept so beautiful, and my oven is over there.
And it's going strong.
Yeah,
People
the
love
oven is
it.
going very strong, the only one in the municipality, and it's great. And it brings more people down.
Certainly.
But getting back to this spot, how many people would ever know as they come up the street, or even if you look in from Windmill, you can't see very much of the cemetery.
That's right. And John Martin, even in the 50s in his book, was writing not many people in Dartmouth know that this exists, and he was saying that more people need to come and check out Geary Street Cemetery, and he recorded so much of its history in his book.
Well, David, we're almost out of time. Is there any last thought you want to give me about this cemetery?
I would like to see some interpretive panels here. So in addition to the monument from the 60s or the monument that talks about the Mi'kmaq but doesn't mention the specific history of Geary Street, I would like to see that put in by the city, and they're the people who manage this park and cemetery right now.
We don't do a very good job of
we need
keeping
more
our
interpretation
history.
here
Our
in the city.
interpretation, we don't have very much at all. And this would be great. And this is where they have when they have the ghosts.
They have ghost tours here,
Yeah,
but I
ghost
think we
tours.
should have some history tours coming through here, and it's a very special place.
Well, David, we've run out of time.
Thanks, Gloria.
And thank you so much for being
Thank
here.
you so much.
You've been watching Destination Dartmouth with Gloria McCluskey, and my guest has been David Jones, the great historian.